So today I wanted to share with you how I got into mobility training and how I shifted my focus to more of one about longevity and being able to continue to progress with fitness as I age. So most of us are not taught about mobility training or about joint function. So what happens with a lot of programs over time is you end up bowing out because of injury or simply because you start burning out, and you just think that's a natural part of aging or part of the fitness process, that it's part and parcel with training is you just simply get injured. But because of what I've experienced, obviously I had to have a very drastically different approach, and what I learned along the way I wanted to share with you. I'm not a fan of talking about this because I feel like I've spoke about it so much on Instagram, and I know it's helpful, but it's like I almost have like a sort of trigger around it because I'm having to relive 2 car accidents just to tell you about it. But I'm going to try my best. In my early 20s I experienced 2 car accidents, and before anyone tells me that I'm a terrible driver, the first one I was a passenger and someone hit the back of the car, and the second one I was the driver but someone hit the back of the car. So naturally I'm really like nervous when there's quick like braking happening in a car, and also this sort of like sudden impact that I wasn't expecting or bracing for created quite a lot of problems with my spine. So I'm going to try to quickly summarize what happened to me without being boring. So at the time of the first car accident, I was a semi-pro skier and I was being entered into the FIS, and my whole identity and plan for life was I was going to be a skier and I was later going to get into property development, and that was my life path. I didn't see anything else other than skiing. So naturally the first car accident really kind of put a spanner in the works, not just physically but emotionally. But luckily I had a really good physio and she really helped me, and I could get back to ski training, although this was with a belt support and it was with pain. So I did still have back pain. It wasn't fully resolved. And when I had the second car crash, this is when things got far more complicated. So I was more or less okay. I was managing fine at the time, but almost instantly with this one, I wasn't okay. I could feel something was wrong. And I had 3 disc herniations and nerve damage in 2 separate parts of my spine. So I had like this constant nervy, searing, like electrical pain all the way down my neck into my fingers. And that affected my grip. So when I was gripping things, I found it very hard to let go of them. They just kind of got stuck. And that wasn't fun. But that pain I didn't even really realize was there until a lot later, because in the beginning, the only thing I felt was my lower back. And this within a few weeks caused quite a lot of complications because the nerve damage was so bad that I had muscle atrophy on one of my legs. And at the time, the physio I had before, who was fantastic with me, she had already retired. So I was bouncing around physio to physio with my insurance, and no one could help me, essentially. I was getting a lot of conflicting reports and a lot of warnings not to move, not to train, not to bend over, not to flex my spine. And obviously I had to have quite a lot of assessments for the insurance claim. So the very first one was really upsetting because they told me that they concluded I'm just going to get worse. And that the only solution for me was going to be surgery a few years down the line as I did get worse, because they were expecting that nerve damage and atrophy to sort of actually make my life significantly harder with time. And they were warning me against trying to weightlift or train, which is what I was doing at the time before I got into the car accident. So they were like, well, you can't do that anymore. So I believed them at first. And I kept asking why the symptoms were happening. Because at one point, my hip bones were like burning, like as if the damage was in my bones. It was very bizarre. And I'd often lose the feeling in my foot and my leg. And there'd be parts of the day where I'd just be dragging my leg for about 10 minutes because I'd just suddenly lose that function. So that wasn't fun. There's some other side effects that I don't really talk about often because it's like a bit private. Basically, I lost the sensation of the need to pee. So you'd think that this would be like pretty bad and that I'd end up wetting myself, but it was the opposite. I ended up not knowing when I needed to pee, and the tension in the muscles in that area was so intense that I found it hard to pee, and I found it hard to feel like when I was supposed to. And after years and years of getting kidney infections and bladder infections, I got some tests and they finally realized that I'm not sensing that So I was told to basically put an alarm on every 2 hours to go to pee. So my life just got kind of miserable in that I was in pain all the time. There was a period of time where I didn't sleep for almost 3 weeks because I was in so much pain. I couldn't move around or even go for a walk without knowing if I could walk back, because if my nerve damage flared up, then I would basically be dragging my leg back. So it was just, my whole life changed instantly. I went from thinking I was an athlete to, well, that's not on the cards for you anymore. And yeah, it completely just changed everything in just a physical and mental way. At this stage, it was probably around a year or more after, and I had started doubting the advice I was given. I was just going from bad to worse, so there was no reason for me to really listen to it much longer. And I started experimenting with mobility training, strength training, and basically trying to build myself back up and seeing how that worked. And I was a coach at the time, so I was getting advice from other coaches, what courses to go on, what books to read. And slowly it did start improving. And all this while I was getting routine checks with my back specialists to see how my muscle atrophy and nerve damage was going. And this whole time I had less and less muscle in one side of my leg, so one of my legs. And basically they were monitoring if it was getting worse or better. And so far it had just been getting worse. And suddenly it had started getting better. And I admitted to the back specialist, I was like, I know I'm not supposed to, but I've been doing this, this, and this. Is that okay? Can I continue to do that? And this is when he said something to me that changed everything. And he kind of leant in like he was telling me a secret, and he was like, I'm not meant to say anything about this, but off the record, yeah, continue doing what you're doing, and you know, it seems to be working. But obviously he was worried because I was doing things like spinal flexion and Jefferson curls, like started to lift heavy, and that's all like a major no-no. And it was like literally on my file, don't do that. The thing is, I was getting better. So he was like, just continue doing it. And that's when that just shifted in my mind that I was given permission to do this. So therefore, this must be the right way forward. And to be honest, I feel like if I didn't have these accidents, I probably would end up in this place anyway, because the way that I was training, especially with my skiing coach and with my mindset at the time, was far too intense. It was far too destructive. And I would have inevitably ended up in this position regardless, just at a later date. Even though the car accidents were a horrible experience and it wasn't fun, I am actually kind of grateful for them, because they changed my mind about training entirely. They made me think about how we train and why we train the way we do. And it made me realize that when I was a skier, I was being pushed far too much, not in a logical way. It was definitely going to lead to a short career. If I continued that way, I would have got injured. And then hold on a minute, why are we always pushing so hard with training in a way that is destructive and may not contribute to longer term goals? Now at 36, I move far better than I did when I was 22. I'm much stronger, I'm more flexible, my joints feel resilient and stable, and I also have much more endurance. So the whole point is, I feel like joint function isn't really tested, spoken about, or taught. And I feel like this should basically be taught at schools, because I have had some younger clients who have been athletes and they cotton on to the terms I'm using so quickly, and they understand joint function so quickly when I teach them. Whereas I feel like it was much harder for me to learn it because I learned it later on. So one thing I wish we did have is just simply lessons on what joints do, how they function, what we need to be aware of, like what's normal. I know a lot of people say, oh, everyone's different, but we're not actually that different. Like, yeah, we have different lever lengths, we've got different heights, we have different muscle insertion points, and that changes how movement works. But fundamentally, your shoulder still has flexion, extension, internal, external rotation, abduction, and it still has a certain degrees, which is considered normal. And we don't really train that. So if we're not training the foundation of what allows movement in our body, then how are we expected to really have longevity in our training when essentially we are causing these areas to either not have any strength or not have any range in certain ranges, and eventually we end up in pain, having to take time off because of injuries. And really, if we just shifted our perspective from trying to be the fastest possible, strongest possible, lean as possible, in as quick as time as possible, instead, if we started thinking, well, what if I can get my joints to function perfectly as well as they can do for my body? then what can I do in the long run with that foundation? So basically, if you feel like you're fighting your body and you want to be working with it and listening to it better, then this is essentially what I want to make more content about. I feel like I had to sort of slightly introduce myself on YouTube because I've never really spoken about who I am and why I'm here. But obviously this was quite a profound experience for me and made me change my entire life path and change the way I see training. And what I try to coach and teach now is simply having a perspective shift in how we're training so that your training sessions are focused around joint function. And of course, you're still going to worry about strength and cardiovascular fitness, but that has to be around the joint function perspective of making sure that you're covering every single joint function and improving the range to the point where it's healthy. And then once you're there, then you can make sure that you're maintaining that while driving forward with your strength and endurance and whatever other goals you may have. If you do want to find out what mobility training is all about, what all the components are, and also try a sample HIIT program, then we have made a free guide, and all you need to do is comment the word guide to get the link.